Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, everybody. To tell you the truth, after Chip's talk, I don't know what else needs to be said. Just as soon pass the mic on to Nelson and we move on. But I do want to say a few things. I'm really happy to be here. And I mean, the three panels so far, I mean, there's a lot of powerful ideas here in this room and here in Fayetteville. And hopefully they will bear some fruit as we move through the next few months and years here in the city and in our state and in the nation. I want to try to frame my brief remarks in terms of wealth disparities, the state, and the foreclosure crisis. I'm just going to touch a little bit on all of that. And to start with a disclaimer, much of what I will say today may not reflect the views of the North Carolina Justice Center. I just want to be clear on that, although I work there along with my colleague Beth. And then the other thing, I do want to tell you that on the first day of early voting, I was number 28 in line and I voted for Obama. But I may say some things that you will wonder about in terms of Obama. But I just want to lay that out, okay, as part of what we're dealing with. And I think, as Chip pointed out, this is quite a juncture. I mean, I think what we're seeing, there may be some turns in this country where it is we can get a sufficient number of white voters to vote for him so that he would become the nominee in the primary, and a sufficient number perhaps on November 4th to vote him into the presidency, right? But it does not mean that all of the problems that we've talked about in this panel heretofore, particularly the question of white privilege and the structural racism that exists, right, are not going to disappear on November the 5th. And we just really need to be clear on that. All of the excitement that people have been demonstrating, from my grandchildren on to my father who's 89, this is beautiful, this is wonderful, but we have to be sober and clear and what we need to do on the other side of this victory that we actually hope to see. I want to talk a little bit about wealth. Nancy asked me to talk about this and this whole idea, the color of wealth and the wealth divide. And the kind of framing I had, it's a wonderful book called The Color of Wealth, published by folks who work at United for a Fair Economy. It's the story behind the U.S. racial divide. It's not the first piece to really tackle this question of race and wealth. A number of people have done it. It's published in 2006. But for me, it really has gathered the data and the analysis based on U.S. history and what's happening to people of color and really taking a look at it. And in terms of wealth, my own background and orientation, and I think many of you in the social justice movement, is to typically look at wages rather than wealth. Okay, how much do we make? What is our annual salary? What is our hourly wage? What do we get from the jobs that we perform? And we fight on that basis alone. And so fighting against discrimination, fighting for affirmative action, all of those things has been on the basis of what we can earn on income, right? This analysis takes this idea of wealth as being another framework to look at. And to demonstrate, right, how it is that we've got these disparities that you can see from the 1850s all the way up until now. And I think it's a fairly healthy analysis. Basically, it is wealth is your assets minus what you owe. And so we're talking about money in the bank, savings. We're talking about home ownership, which is key to what I want to say here today. And it's talking about other assets that you may have, whether it's boats or jewelry or something, mainly the stuff that we don't have in the black community, but certainly part of what you understand to be wealth and assets. And so if we look at it that way, we get a real accurate picture of the possibilities for black people and other people of color to advance. Because if we limit our analysis to just wages, right, you're at the mercy of the discrimination that we've talked about all along the line. That your wages, right, are subject to whether or not you'll be hired. Your wages are subject to whether you'll be laid off first. Your wages are subject to whether or not your plant will close and move to another country. All of those kinds of things are there, wherein wealth is something that you can pass on from generation to generation, and that's what has not happened in terms of African Americans and other people of color. So it's an important thing to look at. So many of you know the program that comes on National Public Radio, the Marketplace, first the numbers, okay, is what they say. So just to give us a little bit of an idea in terms of wealth in this country, the median net worth in 2001 for white people was $120,000, $120,900, right? For people of color, $17,100, right? The mean net worth, okay, and we know the difference between the median and the mean, that the mean is the average amongst our communities, right? For white folks, is $482,534, and for African Americans, $75,748. And for Latino families, $89,175. So we've got this huge disparity in wealth. And much of it has to do with this question of home ownership. And I want to raise that. When we look at, in 2003, at the various communities that we're talking about, 75% of white folks in this country own their homes, and only 48% of African Americans own their homes. Okay? In the Latino community, slightly behind African Americans, 46.7%. Asian and Pacific Islanders, 56.3%. And finally, Native Americans, 54.3%. So you see the kind of disparities that we have there in home ownership. This thing that allows us to pass wealth on from generation to generation is absent, is very difficult. And it makes us think back to the question, some of the earlier period that Chip talked about. Many of us who make the argument for reparations, right? We start from the point of view that home ownership or land ownership, right, was not made available to the African American community. So the ability to pass this wealth along from generation to generation was not there. And it's something we need to think about in this coming period. How does this happen, though? Was it just like, evil white folks, which is an analysis that many people have held on to for far too long? Is it an economic system? And in fact, is it an economic system that has government support to it? And what I want to argument that at key times in the history of this country, there has been government intervention that has contributed to this, so that the privilege that white communities have, right, have been assisted and abetted by government intervention, and the same kind of intervention in the negative side towards communities of color, African Americans, Native Americans, and Latinos. So I just raised a couple of them here for us to think about it, because it's really important in this context today of regulation, deregulation, government intervention, leave it alone, let the markets work itself out, right? Selectively, we find intervention in the history of this country, and we need to think about that as we evaluate the response to the crisis. So let's just take a couple. For white folks, the gold rush, the land claims of 1849, right? Claims on somebody else's land, by the way, right? Slavery, right? The fact that it was codified, right? There were laws, the government supported slavery, and the accumulation of capital and wealth, right, in favor of white folks who were slave owners, who were landowners. The Homestead Act of 1862, right? You could go get you some land, right? Again, somebody else's land, but it was an advantage so that you could accumulate this wealth over time. In terms of Native Americans, right, all of the wars against the tribes from the very beginning, the genocide that was talked about in the first passage, right, you take any of the nations across the country from east to west, and you see that appropriation in those wars, okay? The Sioux, and this is something I didn't know, but something raised in this wonderful book, that the state of Iowa, and maybe some people know that, right, was ceded to the U.S. In 1851, right? All of the claims that the Sioux Nation had were given up to the U.S. So these Iowa farmers, these regular farmers, and even agribusiness there now, right, is built up on the backs of the Native people who had to give that land up. bounties for Native Americans in California, $1 million in 1851 for Native scalps. Right, this is a part of that history. And then finally in 1853, what they call the California Preemptive Act, making all Indian lands available, right, to white settlers, making them all available. African Americans, the history everybody knows well, take it from the Dred Scott decision. An African or a black man has no rights that a white is bound to respect. Dred Scott could not have standing in court so that he could challenge his own enslavement, the fugitive slave laws, and going back to the post-Civil War, 40 acres and a mule that never materialized. But again, these are government interventions or lack of interventions that put us in this type of situation. And then as we have this debate about immigration in this period, right, understanding that free blacks, right, up through the 1850s, right, occupied many of these domestic jobs and low-wage jobs only to be displaced by a new wave of immigrants, right, which was sanctioned by the federal government at that time. Latinos in this country, and notice we've picked, or they've picked 5 groups, Latinos, Native Americans, African Americans, and Asian and Pacific Islanders to look at. There are other subgroups that you might look at, but these are clear in the history. So with Latinos, the whole question of territory and land, okay, the seizure of half of Mexico's territories lost through the Treaty of Guadalupe. We always talk about this question of coming across the borders and building walls, but in the immigrants' rights movement, and particularly in the Chicano movement, they say the border crossed us. We didn't cross the border, right? So we need to be clear on that. What does that mean in terms of land and ownership and the transfer of wealth in this period? The whole issue of manifest destiny not only just deals with the Southwest, but down through Central America and Latin America. And as we have many of those people who have been forced to migrate under current trade policies, right, go back to the history, right, that brings U.S. imperialism into their lands to take out their resources and to put them in the kind of lack of wealth situation that they face today. On Asian and Pacific Islanders, the Chinese Exclusion Act, that kept Chinese out, that prevented Chinese from working in certain industries. The labor movement in its most racist form, right, excluded Chinese workers from being a part of that industry. And then finally, this always really bugs me. We talk about the 1950s and the GI Bill, right, and how that helped, right? This is the post-World War II. This is after the fight for democracy, the fight against fascism, right, that we come home. And so you have a GI Bill to help with school, to help with home ownership, right? Except the problem is that most black folks, most GIs couldn't get into most of the universities in this country. They had to come to Fayetteville States and St. Aug's and A&T and other places because there weren't enough seats available for them in those schools, so most people couldn't take advantage of all of those benefits. And I went to HBCU. I remember this, of course, was in the 60s, and you still had this legacy of Korean vets and others coming in with their GI benefits, but they weren't at UNC, okay? They weren't at Duke, and they weren't at the larger institutions. So again, what you might get out of that education and the accumulation of wealth and income, you didn't have that because of this discrimination. Same thing with housing, right? GI Bill provided housing opportunities, but then if you couldn't get loans, if you were redlined out of certain communities, and in fact, if you did get them into communities where the value of the homes did not appreciate in the same way that the values of the homes appreciated in white communities. So you get this disparity here too. Two groups of people supposing to get the same benefits provided by the government, but not benefiting in the same kinds of way. So what we have now in terms of this crisis, I mean, you've got what I call the convergence of the American dream and this whole new set of asset building stuff that's a kind of trend out here in the community development movement, that what we have to do is build up assets, we've got to get homes and whatnot. It's not just jobs, the stuff I talked about before. But we almost have a religion in this country about home ownership, right? That's the American dream. You have to own a home, right? And the government has really supported that kind of thing since, maybe 1913 or so. I think that's when they started giving tax deductions for interest payments on mortgages. And during the Depression, I think maybe Chip mentioned this stuff, like certain measures were taken to help with home ownership at that time. And then we talk about the post-World War II infusion of home stuff. But it gets people to the point where that's all they think about, is owning a home at any cost, So this criticism about the Community Reinvestment Act, right? I think we talk about a community that's set up, that's primed to be handed, right, some bad loan products as they try to get these homes and whatnot, right? That people pounced on them, that people saw that they could make a lot of money off of this, and the development of the subprime market, where people could make tons and tons of money, right, using black folks and people of color as victims, right? All kinds of loans, no interest-only loans, no stated income. You don't have to tell people how much you made, right? All kinds of tricks, right? Terms on some of these adjustable rate mortgages that you didn't see when you sat down for your closing, all kinds of tricks. And one of the problems now, brothers and sisters, we've got like thousands and thousands of people who still aren't trying to work these things out because they are ashamed. They think it has something to do with them, some weaknesses on their part, that they made mistakes, not knowing that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are being foreclosed now, and that it's a trick of the government and that they need to come forward. And that's part of what some of our programs and communities are trying to do to work on that. Cumberland County, from January to September, 1,332 starts on foreclosures. That's just starts, right? That's not whether or not they're going through. Some of them have been avoided. Some people might go into bankruptcy and hold it off, whatnot. But that's just the starts, people filing papers, right? And I've got some maps if you're interested in different areas of Cumberland County to see how that actually works out. In the state of North Carolina, we're talking about that same period, 41,000 starts. 41,000. And I mean, as Chip pointed out, this thing just keeps going on. It keeps going on. And not only are we talking about people actually losing their homes, but the question of equity in those homes, that's lost, okay? And even the people who manage to keep their homes, because they got these loans at higher interest rates with arms on them or balloon payments, it means that the equity that they would have built up, right, is lost, right? That their loans cost so much more over the life of a mortgage if they're able to keep that. People estimate for some of these loans anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000 per family. So you just add that up for a community and see what that actually means. So it's part of a real crisis. We think that we should be arguing, beside the legislation that's been passed, like here in North Carolina, extending the period that people have before that the lender can close them out, in spite of the $700 billion bailout, or even the Housing Recovery Act passed in July, we need a moratorium now, right now. That's got to be part of the package. And I'm sorry to say that Obama doesn't have that yet. And I say yet, because I have confidence that we as a movement and that circumstances may push him in that way. But we need to have a moratorium to hold this thing off so people can maintain these homes, right? This is a time, I believe, that we really have to challenge the system. And we can have these conversations. We can't sit back and gloat about a victory on November 4th. We have to really push these things out. And I think what it does for us, here we are having a conference about race. I think it tells us that something, that race will not be enough. Race is not enough. People are thinking that because Obama given his roots and what he represents, might change things. But any of us here, I think we used the term the gray heads in here earlier, Nancy, know enough that we've seen many African American politicians come into situations where they could not control what was taking place. Whether it was in Newark with Kenneth Gibson, Coleman in Detroit, you go on and name them. When you inherit something that's fundamentally and structurally rotten, what is it that you're able to do? And so we've got to talk about that. We've got to really get this sense of achievement out of the way. I think it's good for my grandson to see a black person elected as president, but I want him to be clear on what it is that people do, so that while people were happy about Colin Powell endorsing Obama, and maybe that will help him, we also got to know that Colin Powell is connected to what some people would call war crimes, right? In Vietnam, in the My Lai massacre. That you also need to know that he was the chief apologist for our attack, our occupation in Iraq. And so we got to be able to balance those kinds of things and understand that. And then finally, getting to November 4th and 5th, it's a question of whether or not they will steal the elections, right? And so what we're saying is that there's enough evidence out there that 2000 and 2004 were stolen, and that there are things that are happening as we speak today, to disenfranchise people, whether it's machines flipping the votes in West Virginia, right, or people being turned away because their names have been stricken from the rolls. It could happen, and the question is, what will we do if they steal the election? And we're saying that on November 5th, we should be in the streets celebrating or protesting. Thank you.